Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the episode of today. So, this episode, I'm finally bringing you the episode of caffeine and cortisol. So, I've covered caffeine before a lot on the podcast. Well, I don't know about a lot, but I've definitely covered it on the podcast. I think I even have an episode on caffeine, but specifically, we're talking about caffeine and cortisol. Last Monday or Tuesday, I released an episode on cortisol in general. And I put the call out for people to send me questions about anything cortisol related. Please go listen to that episode if you're interested in the effects of caffeine on cortisol, because in the cortisol episode, I go in depth about exactly what cortisol does within the body, the role it plays in the body. I'm not going to be covering that again on this episode. So this is like a part 2. So I think that even if you're just interested in the caffeine side of things, it will benefit you to understand the role that cortisol plays in the body as well. Because really, if you listened to last week, you'd know, and if you haven't yet listened to it, go check it out. You'd know that cortisol is not something to be demonized, that unless you are actually suffering from chronic stress where your cortisol levels are abnormally elevated and they're elevated all the time. So separate from that, cortisol is something that should be harnessed in order to increase your energy, increase your performance and focus. It's just so beneficial in so many aspects of our life. And I talk about the importance of the cortisol spike in the morning and why that is so good, and why you shouldn't be thinking, how do I lower my cortisol in the morning? If anything, you want to be making sure that you've just got a nice balanced level of cortisol. So you want to harness cortisol in the morning. This is when we want it to be high. It is naturally supposed to be at its highest in the morning. A lot of people think, but I don't want to wake up with high cortisol. That's how we're designed to be. And the reason for that is so we are ready to take on the day. The issue is when you are highly stressed, whether it's emotional stress or physical stress, and you're just not letting your body recover, and you've got heightened cortisol throughout. So we want a nice peak in the morning. This is why natural sunlight is great to help increase the peak of cortisol. So we're more ready, we're more awake, alert, we feel good. And then throughout the day, that cortisol is going to naturally taper down. There are going to be things within your day that are going to spike that cortisol, all kinds of things like ice bath, exercise, emotional stress, frustration, coffee, all sorts of things. But the small spikes of cortisol are not what we are here to avoid. What we are trying to avoid is putting ourselves under increased stress for prolonged periods of time, whether that be physical or emotional, or it could even be, as you see with coffee, having excessive amounts of stimulant as well can do that, okay? So go check out that episode because I talk about it way more in depth. But I thought let's go through, I first want to break down the role of caffeine, okay, which is obviously the active component of coffee, and that's what we're talking about. And caffeine is caffeine. It's a molecule. So whether you're taking caffeine in an energy drink versus a coffee versus whatever, you're looking at the caffeine component and how big that dose of caffeine actually is, all right? So the first thing that we're going to do is break down the role of caffeine, and then I'm going to be talking about it from like a cortisol perspective as well. So caffeine is classified as a central nervous system stimulant, okay? And its organic molecule is called methylxanthine, okay? And the effects of caffeine happen because caffeine binds to the adenosine receptor, all right? Habib's just giving me the side eye as he walks in. Come here, my little baby. Yes, you can. Hello. Come here, my love. Hi. So caffeine has its effects by binding to the adenosine receptor. You might hear it called adenosine. So when it binds, it blocks the adenosine from binding to that same binding site on the receptor. Now, what this means is that it is a competitive antagonist at the adenosine receptor, okay? So you are competing at that same site. So when you hear about competitive agonist or competitive antagonist, you're looking at a molecule that is competing at a binding site of a receptor. So I'm going to give you an explanation of what adenosine is in a second. But caffeine competes at that binding site. And once it binds into that site, adenosine cannot bind, right? It's blocking that. And when I talk about agonist versus antagonist, an agonist is going to increase that function and an antagonist is going to, basically an agonist is going to do more of the same and an antagonist is going to compete. So adenosine basically is what helps us fall asleep. It's what makes us sleepy. It's what makes us drowsy, what makes us fall asleep. Okay, so basically, caffeine is a competitive antagonist at the adenosine receptor. Now, what this means is we've got receptors, many receptors in our brain that take care of many different functions, and you've got molecules that bind to these receptors and then it causes an action, okay? Adenosine is, I'm going to go into it in a second, but it's basically responsible for a lot of things and making us fall asleep and all of that. Caffeine competes at the binding site that adenosine is supposed to bind into. Now, when you're talking about a competitive antagonist, you're looking at something that not only competes at the binding site, but antagonizes what adenosine should do. So if adenosine is making you sleepy, caffeine is going to do the opposite. It antagonizes. It's not an agonist, it's an antagonist, okay? So we're getting the opposite effect, basically. And blocking this adenosine receptor has indirect effects on the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, glutamate, and GABA as well, okay? So we see a rise in these chemicals. Not only are we blocking adenosine, which is the main function of caffeine, but we're also seeing a rise in all these other neurochemicals, neurotransmitters. And then, of course, we see an effect on mood, memory, cognitive function, alertness, all of the above. So you've got the primary role, which is the competitive antagonist at the binding site of the adenosine receptor. And then you've got the kind of indirect secondary function, which is the increase in all these other neurotransmitters as well, okay? Now, the blockage or the binding is what's impacting the release of norepinephrine, acetylcholine, glutamate, dopamine, all of that. Now, let's talk about adenosine. Adenosine. I'm probably going to interchangeably pronounce it 1,000 different ways. Adenosine is a naturally occurring nucleoside. Like most chemicals in the body, it is promiscuous, meaning that it does more than one thing. So when you hear about chemicals, hormones, whatever being promiscuous from like a physical chemical standpoint, it means that it does more than one thing, which is like most things within the body. There's many functions for many things. In the body, your physical body, not your brain, in the body, adenosine, its role is in assisting cellular energy transfer, okay? So it forms molecules like ATP and ADP, so adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate, among other things. So as we know, or as you may or may not know, ATP is the main energy carrier of like within the cells. So when the body needs to move or when it even needs to repair, it requires ATP. And basically, in a nutshell, it's just providing the cell with the energy that it needs. In the brain, however, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, specifically, in the brain, it is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So adenosine can act as a central nervous system depressant, okay, which means that it is depressing or decreasing activity within the brain. It suppresses arousal and it promotes sleep, okay? The lowest time that you're going to have naturally occurring levels of adenosine in the brain is just before waking, okay? That's what, among other things, causes us to awake, okay? After a good sleep. If you're completely sleep deprived, this is probably not going to be the case. And then we see a small spike of adenosine in the transition from sleep to wake. That's why sometimes you're a bit like, oh, I want to go back to sleep, whatever, but then once you're up, you're up. And then it stabilizes quite low, and then the levels very slowly begin to rise throughout the day until the onset of sleep at nighttime, where it's going to be the highest. And then after you've fallen asleep, you're going to get a drop, okay? So as you can imagine, if caffeine is binding to the site of the adenosine receptor, it's going to keep you alert for longer because it's blocking adenosine from binding, which is promoting drowsiness. It's promoting it's suppressing arousal, all of that. So caffeine is stopping that from happening, okay? So that's pretty basic. That all makes sense. Another thing is that caffeine has a really similar molecular structure to adenosine. So it can very easily cross the blood-brain barrier. That's why we get quite significant and notable effects in the brain, because it goes bang, crosses the blood-brain barrier with no dramas, and it binds to the receptors. Now, cortisol release, as I mentioned in the last episode, in the body follows the circadian rhythm, okay? So circulating levels of cortisol are lowest when you're falling asleep, and they slowly begin to increase throughout your sleep, and they peak when you awake, okay? Now, after this peak, it begins to decline throughout the whole day, minus the little spikes that you're going to get through activities and through things that you do. But with the onset, and also like with the onset of like major stressful events. But overall, you're going to see a decline so we can then fall asleep. And the thing that governs this, and I'm not going to go into it because I explained it on last Tuesday's episode, is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That's what's governing it, and it helps regulate the alertness and sleep kind of modulation. Now let's talk about how does caffeine have its effects on cortisol release. So I'm going to explain, and then I'm going to go into all your questions and break it down, okay? So caffeine exerts its effects on cortisol release by stimulating the central nervous system, because it's a central nervous system stimulant, and by doing so, it interacts with this HPA axis. So I'm going to break it down step by step. So you've got, number one, the blockage of the adenosine receptor, which I've already explained. Number two, we are activating this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So you know how I just mentioned that you get that indirect spike in all these neurochemicals that promote arousal and alertness and all of the above, and mood and all of that. You're also getting, so when you get that increase in excitatory neurotransmitters, so excitatory is activity within the brain, it causes the hypothalamus to create a body's stress response. Now, don't think of all stress responses as being bad. It's like you're kind of looking at it as your body's response to like it's go time, it's action time. So this could mean I just need to get up and go and energy to perform for the day. So stress, I want you to look at it as ambiguous for the purpose of this episode, unless I talk about chronic stress or bad stress or something like that. Then once, of course, the hypothalamus is activated, this HPA axis, it then signals the pituitary gland to release this adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, if you remember from last episode. And then that then stimulates the adrenal glands, which of course produces and releases cortisol, right? Now, the adrenal glands release the cortisol, and that hormone obviously is going to help your body manage stress by increasing glucose availability, enhancing your metabolism. That's what's going to prepare you for like fight or flight, all of that. And then it's also increasing like activation of the sympathetic nervous system, but then all of this still falls back into that negative feedback loop. So you're getting that nice rise in cortisol. Caffeine is going to stimulate this HPA axis, but the HPA axis is also involved in noting when we've got enough cortisol or when that cortisol is not needed anymore. And then we do this like down negative kind of switching off effect, because it down regulates. It sends a message being like, we need to produce a little bit less now. We don't need that. So if everything's functioning normally, you're getting this nice feedback loop. Cortisol is released when it's necessary, and then when we don't need it, blah, it goes down. When we need it, it goes up, blah, 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 and it keeps going round and round and round the whole day long, okay? Now, like I said, cortisol levels are naturally highest in the morning because of our circadian rhythm. And when caffeine is taken in the morning, the effect of your cortisol release is going to be more pronounced because the hypothalamic pituitary axis is already activated, okay? Now, later in the day, your cortisol levels are going to be lower in general. So the effects of caffeine on cortisol production are less significant, okay? However, you are still going to get a smaller spike in cortisol. That spike still does occur, especially in people who are sensitive to caffeine, but it's not going to be as pronounced as it is in the morning, all right? So we're getting this mediation through the HPA axis. You're getting the link between cortisol in the morning versus not as intense in the evening. We're understanding how caffeine now stimulates the hypothalamus and how that stimulates the whole cortisol release. Now let's go into some of your questions. A lot of your questions were, I had a lot of the same questions coming through, which is great because it means that a lot of people are wondering the same thing. So let's start with the first one, which was probably the most popular question. And I think the reason why it's also the most popular question is because how common this is spoken about currently in social media. But it's about, do you have coffee straight away, waking up? Or do you need to wait to have the first coffee? Ideally, if possible, you do want to wait about an hour, maybe an hour and a half to have the first coffee, okay? Now, people are saying, when is a good time to have coffee for those like coffee lovers? Or people are saying, how can we make ourselves less dependent on caffeine? Because I want to feel awake, I want to feel productive, but I don't want to have to depend on caffeine. So if you want to know when is a great time and also not be as dependent, but also maximize the effects of your coffee, you're better off probably waiting about an hour and a half. Now, is it going to be detrimental and bad for you to have coffee first thing in the morning? No, you'll survive. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's actually fine. I'm going to go into coffee on an empty stomach later in this episode. But basically, the reason why it is a good idea to wait roughly an hour after waking is because you already get this natural spike in cortisol when you wake up, okay? You got that CAR, that cortisol awakening response. So we're awake, bang, you get that natural rise in cortisol. And if you listen to my episode and all these other specialists that are neuroscientists that say get outside in the sunlight, that's also going to help with that beautiful spike in cortisol, which is great. That's what we want, okay? Then your cortisol levels are peaking around half an hour to 45 minutes after waking, okay? Your natural rise, that bang rise, okay? And then it's going to decline throughout the day, like I said earlier. If you have caffeine immediately upon waking, when your cortisol is already at its peak, then it might actually interfere with your body's natural alert, ability to be super alert, okay? And so you might, by doing the two at the same time, it may, not for everyone, but it may actually interfere with both things. You might not get the effects of caffeine as much as you would have liked to, and you might not get that nice natural waking response as much as you would like to, okay? And then we also need to know that when you drink coffee, well, firstly, drinking coffee regularly is going to result in caffeine tolerance to an extent. You're still going to get the benefits of the caffeine, but someone who drinks coffee every single day versus someone who doesn't is not going to see as big a spike in cortisol at the best of times, okay? Because we've got this tolerance basically that we build up. But if you do it when your cortisol levels are at that nice peak in the morning, you're probably going to get that tolerance develop a lot faster, okay? We also don't want to get our bodies relying on the caffeine in the morning to be the thing that wakes us up when we could be using our natural awakening response to wake us up. So you want to be like, how do I make sure that my body's doing this naturally? And then once I get that spike, I can then go and have coffee soon after, round the hour mark-ish, give or take for each individual. And then you're going to feel probably a lot more alert for a lot longer as well, because you got the natural one. You're not doing both at the same time, and then bang, you go in for that second peak with a nice, beautiful coffee in the morning, all right? So that also, there are something, and Huberman actually talks about this, so go check out the Huberman episode because he talks about this more in depth, but he talks about that can also minimize the mid-morning crash. He says that if you do coffee and that cortisol spike around the same time, you might be getting a mid-morning crash, but if you stagger the two, then you're less likely to experience that mid-morning crash, okay? Now, also, if you are not sleep deprived, so if you've had a good sleep, then having a coffee immediately after waking is not going to be that effective because the adenosine receptors are not occupied. Remember when I was talking about adenosine, the levels are the lowest in the morning and then they're higher later on in the day as they start to increase. You're not going to be that sleepy or tired or the onset. Your body's trying to actually wake you up if all is well and if you had a good sleep. The body's already trying to wake you up. So doing it straight away, it's not going to be as effective as waiting about an hour or waiting a couple of hours to have your coffee. Or if you're someone like me who has a few coffees in the day, you're waiting a little bit longer. Now, this is something that I actually have tried myself very, very recently because I love having coffee first thing in the morning. And this is more just a habitual thing for the taste of the coffee. I'm someone who's already, once I'm out of bed, I'm relatively alert. I don't rely on coffee to wake me up. And I'm lucky enough that if I don't have coffee all day, as much as I'd miss it for the taste and the smell, it's not like I can't function. I function pretty much the same. There's not much of a difference. But the taste and the smell is just, I fucking love it, right? But the last week, I'm like, especially because I was doing these episodes, I'm like, just wait the hour, Alexis, because that's what. And I've actually found that I'm feeling even more alert. I thought I was alert, but this is actually making me feel more alert because I'm using that wave of my own cortisol awakening response first thing in the morning. So give it a go. And the beauty is if you're a coffee lover, it doesn't take away from you having your coffee. You just need to wait an hour. Maybe have, I don't know, water with lemon or something as your ritual first thing when waking, and then wait an hour. And if an hour's just give it a go. And if you absolutely can't, then it's not the end of the world. It's fine. You just might get a bit of a morning crash later on, possibly. But again, not everyone. And like I said, if you are a habitual coffee user, the cortisol secretion with caffeine consumption is going to be blunted to an extent versus someone that does not have coffee regularly. So if you're somebody that's heard on social media, oh my God, get rid of your coffee in the morning, that's not really a thing that you have to worry about. Again, if you are chronically stressed and your cortisol levels are insanely high, there's many things that you probably should be looking at to lower your cortisol level, but removing that one coffee in the morning is likely not going to be the thing that changes it for you. There's probably bigger underlying issues within your day-to-day, and it's not going to be this one coffee in the morning that's doing it. Because again, like I said, cortisol spike in the morning is a good thing, all right? Now, next question. Caffeine after midday. Is there a time that you should stop drinking caffeine so it doesn't affect you so much? So on average, you've got to look at the half-life of caffeine. Now, keep in mind that the sensitivity towards caffeine varies significantly from person to person. There's so many factors that impact how caffeine affects the individual, and I will be covering that a little bit later in this episode. But on average, caffeine has a half-life of around 3 to 5 hours. So a half-life means that it takes, well, in this case, 3 to 5 hours for your body to eliminate half of the caffeine you've consumed. So when you hear about half-life of a drug, that's the time that it takes for the body to consume or metabolize or whatever, half of that drug, half of the dose. It can actually take 15 to, in some, this to me sounds extreme, but in some cases, 15 to 25 hours for your caffeine to be completely cleared from the system. So it's not, the first half is a lot quicker than the second half. Okay, so a half-life is the most intense feeling that you're going to get, and then it just tapers and tapers and tapers. But that tapering is a lot slower than the first half, where your body's really like metabolizing it and feeling the effects of it. Okay, so what I was saying, the most noticeable stimulating effects are going to wear off within the first 4, for some people 6 hours. Okay, but caffeine can still affect your sleep for many hours after that. Even if, like if you're consuming it later on in the day, it's likely going to be affecting your sleep, even if you fall asleep and don't have trouble falling asleep. So you might be someone that, oh, but I have no trouble falling asleep, but when my alarm goes off, I can not get up. I don't know what you're talking about this spike in the morning. I feel like shit in the morning. I need every stimulant I can think of under the sun to get me up out of bed. Then probably look at your caffeine consumption in the evening, because it will be affecting your sleep. Like I said about the adenosine, blocking the adenosine, we need to start seeing a build-up on the tail end of the day of that adenosine. And if we're having caffeine too late, again, like I said, some people, of course, do have a caffeine tolerance and it's not going to affect them as much. But for everyone, you're going to see some effect, okay? So if you're really trying to maximize your sleep, then I wouldn't be having a coffee, especially if you're going all out here. I would not be having a coffee in the first, like after probably, if you want to get really strict, after midday. I personally try not to have coffee after 2 p.m. most days, but I definitely go over it when I'm, visiting my parents. I have coffee like 45,000 times a day when I'm with my dad and my mum. But yeah, give it a go, and it might actually affect, like you might feel a lot brighter in the morning. So keep your coffees to the morning, all right? Now, I had a question that says, does coffee in the morning make you gain weight? And the answer is no, it doesn't. So obviously taking away from the actual calories that are being consumed in the coffee, like putting that aside. So if you're someone that has sugar, and if you have, because obviously those things are going to contribute to your overall energy intake within the day. But the caffeine component itself, I think a lot of people fear that like high levels of cortisol are going to make you gain weight. But again, referring back to the episode from last week, chronically high levels of cortisol will, one of the symptoms of that is weight gain. But when your cortisol levels are healthy and you're getting these spikes throughout the day in the healthy way that it should, it's actually does the opposite effect. It actually works as a bit of an appetite suppressant. You're not hungry all the time. There's a lot of, like, when you've got that negative feedback loop of cortisol as it should be, not a positive feedback loop that happens when you're chronically stressed, then it actually does not make you gain weight. If anything, it may be suppressing your appetite a little bit, okay? And coffee also has like appetite suppressing properties. So these small spikes of cortisol do contribute to weight loss unless, like I said, it's chronic stress, okay? The next question was coffee when pregnant. This isn't directly related to cortisol, but I thought I'd answer it because there were many, many questions. So basically the consensus from most professionals and studies and whatever say that around 200, roughly 200 milligrams per day seems to be considered safe. So that's like roughly one and a half coffees, okay? But I probably just stick to one coffee. Any more than that could lead to complications. And this is because the reason for this is that caffeine is able to pass through the placenta and enter the baby's bloodstream. And a developing fetus does not have the enzymes to break down caffeine the same way that an adult has, okay? So the way the baby's body responds to caffeine is going to be very different to how the adult's body responds to caffeine and how it's broken down and all of that, okay? So it then can build up in the baby's bloodstream if you're having multiple coffees a day, and that can affect its development. So it's associated, high levels of caffeine during pregnancy are associated with low birth weight. Given that it's a stimulant, it can increase the baby's heart rate and the mother's heart rate, which can cause a reduction of blood flow to the placenta. Some studies report that there's an increased risk of miscarriage or preterm babies as well. So if you're unsure, the 200 milligram is deemed safe by medical professionals. All right, next question. Someone said, why does caffeine suddenly make me anxious when I used to tolerate it a lot? And there's a lot of people that feel this way. And it has to do with many different factors. So it could be the changes within your metabolism, the enzymes to break it down. So as we get older, and I'm not talking about into old age, I'm talking about just in general, as you mature from decade to decade, you can actually develop a sensitivity to certain stimulants, okay? Changes in your hormones will also affect how how caffeine is metabolized. So also for women going through menopause, we see a lot of changes as well. It can even lead to anxiety or jittery, like feeling jittery when it never used to before. It can affect your sleep all of a sudden when you used to be someone that could just drink coffee well into the afternoon and then sleep like a baby. So the thing is, you got to keep in mind that the way it interacts with hormones, the way it interacts with your metabolism, there's many different factors that will contribute. So you might be someone that's noticed a change and it's just got to do with how your body might be changing, or it could be maybe after something's happened, maybe even after you've given birth, you're noticing a change in how your body, reacts to caffeine. Now the beloved question, no caffeine before food question. People want to know that, are there studies to show that drinking caffeine on an empty stomach spikes your cortisol more than after eating? Yes. Having caffeine on an empty stomach is going to give you more of a cortisol spike than if you have caffeine on a full stomach. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So when caffeine is consumed on an empty stomach, it's obviously going to be absorbed faster into the bloodstream, okay? Which of course leads to like a much faster and stronger response from the body, because it's how your body metabolizes things. When you have something in your gut, it is actually slowing down the rate of absorption, or it's even slowing down how much is being absorbed, okay? Which makes sense because there's other things mixing in there and your body can't absorb everything at the exact same time. So yes, having it on an empty stomach, you're going to notice you're going to get a bit more of a spike than on a full stomach. The other thing that you want to be aware of is that eating food, primarily carbs, carbohydrates, blunts the rise in cortisol. This also tends to be one of the reasons why when people are super stressed, they are reaching for carby foods, okay? Because they're trying to reduce this level of stress and the body is reaching for carbs. That's why when you're chronically stressed, you might notice weight gain, or you might notice a tendency to be craving carby food, sugars, okay? But if we're referring to the morning, and what I spoke about getting that nice rise in cortisol and then the coffee after, I personally, unless you are caffeine sensitive and it gives you jitters and you're like, ooh, it makes me feel anxious, which I'll talk about in a second, then still there's no negative health repercussions having coffee on an empty stomach. You're going to get more of a spike. It's going to be more of a pronounced effect, which again is not a bad thing unless you feel that it's unpleasant because you're sensitive to caffeine, because it gives you jitters, because you already experience anxiety, and coffee on top of that, given that it is a central nervous system stimulant, is going to stimulate you. It can actually exacerbate feelings of anxiety because any kind of stimulant can do that for someone with anxiety. All right. So I think it's really important to pay attention to like knowing absorption rate. Whatever's in your stomach is going to interfere with that. But also if you've got carbohydrates in your stomach, it's already blunting the cortisol response. So personally, I don't like to have breakfast straight off the bat. I like to feel a bit more alert. Fasting also helps increase cortisol a little bit. And then when you break the fast, especially with carbs, you're going to get that dip in cortisol. So I personally, and each to their own, you've got to find what works out for you. If you're someone that can't function without an early morning breakfast, eat your breakfast in the morning. You've got to tailor all what I tell you, all the science behind it. You still have to tailor that. It's got to work for you. But personally for myself, I wake up, now I'm waiting about an hour before my first coffee, but wake up, I like to have coffee on an empty stomach, love it, fucking love it. And then I probably don't eat until probably the 10 a.m. mark, sometimes 10:30, sometimes 11. And it's nothing to do with caloric reduction. I eat quite a fucking lot throughout the day, but my first meal just doesn't really tend to be early. The exception to that is when I'm on holidays and I'm following more of the traditional like breakfast in the morning, lunch, dinner. I'm probably going to be having breakfast then. But when I'm doing my everyday Monday to Friday living my life, I'm having breakfast way later. And then someone asked, will drinking coffee before breakfast negatively impact my brain health? There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that that's the case. So no, it will not. Like I said, if you are prone to anxiety, you got to work with how your body is and maybe don't have it if it doesn't feel good, but it's not bad for you, okay? Someone said, does coffee actually give you more energy? Why does everyone say that they feel more energetic drinking it? So yes, it's keeping you awake or it's stopping you from getting sleepy and it's, promoting more alertness when adenosine is blocked. But there's also that indirect influence on serotonin that occurs because parts of the brain are getting activated with like attention, reward processing, motivation, and that's going to be releasing serotonin, which actually feels good. But also in addition, you're getting this enhanced dopamine signaling, okay? So this allows, and what this means by enhanced dopamine signaling is when you drink coffee, it allows more dopamine to remain in that synapse for a little bit longer, okay? And when there's more dopamine in the synapse, it means that the effects of dopamine can be increased because it gives more opportunity for dopamine to activate the receiving receptors or the receiving cell, okay? So, of course, that is going to make you feel happier, more dopamine. It's going to make you feel more focused, more alert, more motivated, more willing to do things. That's like your drive, your willpower. Oh, let's go. Plus, cortisol, bang, you feel fucking good in the morning. Everybody wins, okay? And that is one of the key reasons, this increased dopamine signaling, along with alertness, as to why coffee is linked to improved mood. Asterisk, unless you suffer from anxiety and you feel like fucking shit because you're jittering and, not feeling great. And in addition to that, caffeine contains compounds such as I always get these words wrong, so just bear with me. Chlorogenic acid and antioxidants, which can contribute to your mood as well because they've got neuroprotective effects. They support your brain health. And caffeine is also implicated in reducing inflammation within the brain. Its primary effects are on dopamine and obviously on adenosine. And then it's got indirect effects on serotonin because you're enhancing mood and arousal. And that's going to get a nice release of serotonin. Then we got questions asking SSRIs and coffee. So SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It is like the go-to first line of defense when we're talking about depression and other mood disorders, but primarily depression. So mixing caffeine with SSRIs actually can have both positive and negative effects. There are studies on both, okay? But it depends on the individual. So caffeine, as we know, can enhance alertness, it can enhance focus, so it can increase anxiety, it can increase jitteriness and insomnia if you're having high doses of coffee. And sometimes the SSRI can interfere with caffeine metabolism as well. But in general, it's safe to consume in moderation. And if you're someone that's taking SSRIs and you're taking coffee and you're feeling fine, then that's fine. But it is, again, it's person to person dependent, because you've got to keep in mind that there's many other things that can affect the metabolism and how you experience caffeine. So you just want to monitor how your body responds to it. One coffee might be fine. That second one could just tip you over the edge and it doesn't feel good. So it's not to say that, oh, but if I have 2 coffees, it's bad. Does that mean that coffee is bad for me? Not necessarily. You might have a threshold where it feels great, and then too much, you're just too stimulated, it doesn't feel good. Okay. Now, someone said, is it true that people can be more sensitive to coffee? Absolutely. So this is what I was going to talk about. These are the main factors that contribute to someone's sensitivity to caffeine. So the first one is genetics. So slow caffeine metabolizers. So this is due to variations in particular genes that you might have within your genetics. There's one gene called CYP1A2 gene. So if I can memorize that for a fucking fun fact at a party. The other one is your adenosine receptor sensitivity. Okay. So you might have increased sensitivity to caffeine's blocking of adenosine. Now there are going to be, if you never have coffee, you're going to be way more sensitive, probably going to be way more sensitive than someone who has like a blunted response because they've got like a tolerance to coffee, okay? Body weight plays a role in it as well. Smaller individuals might feel the stronger effects as opposed to much taller, much bigger individuals. Again, the tolerance. Some people are tolerant because you've built up the tolerance. Some people are not. Age. Older adults will probably metabolize coffee slower. Sleep deprivation. So if you are really fatigued or really tired, then you might feel the effects more than if you weren't. Certain medications can also interfere. Coffee on an empty stomach, you're going to feel the effects more so than not. Or you might be someone that when you have coffee on an empty stomach, because the effects are more pronounced, that gives you anxiety. But when you don't have it, when you have it on a full stomach, you don't get the anxiety, which makes sense because of what I spoke about the effects being more pronounced. And then hormonal factors, pregnancy, menstrual cycle can also determine how you feel having caffeine for some people, okay? Now I've got some shorter questions that I'm just going to pump out some answers to. So someone asked, what is a good dosage of caffeine that will wake you up but not give you the jitters? And there is no direct answer for that. But if you are sensitive, you want to stick to around 150 to 200 milligrams. And if you always get the jitters, try with food, try without, and see what works. Just have the one coffee for the day. And then if you feel perfectly fine and you would love that second coffee in the day, then you can have that second coffee in the day. Someone said, is there something as too much coffee? Yes, in the sense of when it is that you're having it as well, because you also, you don't want to be absolutely completely so tolerant and you have so much caffeine that you're not getting the effects. You also want it to be effective. You don't want to be having too much coffee too close to sleep, because that is going to affect the quality of your sleep. So I do believe that there could be something as too much coffee, especially if it's affecting your sleep or your jitteriness and things like that. I personally have around 3 coffees a day on a normal day, but I can go up to 5 coffees. Lol, I don't know if that's what you're supposed to do, but personally, because I'm just not caffeine sensitive. Someone who's caffeine sensitive would be like that. It sounds like fucking torture for me, okay? So again, very dependent on the individual. Then someone said, am I drinking coffee for the enjoyment of it or for a physiological effect? And when does it matter? So the thing is that I think both are important. If you're enjoying it, you're doing it for your soul, you're feeling good, it's great. And of course the physiological effects, you're getting that alertness, you're getting the dopamine, increased dopamine signaling, but you're also getting the indirect effects on your serotonin, blah, 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 all of the above. But I think that if you are doing it for the enjoyment and it's not a need, then make sure that you're waiting the first hour of the day, because obviously you can hold off for the first hour and you're probably going to really feel a nice physiological effect, more so than if you had it first thing getting out of bed. Someone said, is caffeine bad for anxiety? You're just going to probably exacerbate your anxiety symptoms because it is a stimulant of the central nervous system, okay? It's not that it is quote unquote bad, but it's stimulating you. So the symptoms of like what you feel in your tummy, the jitteriness, all of that, that is going to just increase how you are experiencing your anxiety, okay? Someone said, can I have pre-workout in the evening, 175 milligrams of caffeine before going to the gym? This is probably going to impact your sleep. That's the problem. With the half-life of caffeine, if you're doing it in the evening and then you're going straight to sleep, it's probably going to take 4 to 6 hours for your body to completely, stop feeling the effects of that caffeine. So even if you can still go to sleep, it might be impacting your sleep quality. So pay attention to, if you feel great doing it and you're like, no, I wake up and I'm fresh as a fucking daisy. I feel like I've had the best sleep of my life and it's all good, then that's fine. But also I feel like with your pre-workouts, when it comes to pre-workouts in general, I've got like a specific relationship with how I feel about pre-workouts. If you need the pre-workout, fine. But I also think that, I don't know, I don't want to like bash pre-workouts because it's not a bad thing. I have coffee as my pre-workout. But also I don't think that you need to be stimulating yourself in order to exercise. If you're in a position where you've got to be like, I need all the ammo that I can get in order to work out, then maybe it means that you are fatigued or tired or you're not getting enough. Like I feel like you should be able to approach a workout with, as long as you're fueled properly and you're eating enough food, with just a simple coffee or nothing at all, okay? So I think, when people were taking that what was it called? Jacked or I don't know what, there's some hectic ones and the caffeine and you're like buzzing. I just don't think that is A, necessary, and B, a smart idea personally. But yeah, just like a caffeine dose, see how you go. But again, try not to have it too close to bedtime because you don't want it affecting your sleep. And sleep is the most important thing in the world for your health. And then the final question is, do we need to cut out coffee if we think that our cortisol may be too high? Okay. I think that, look, there's many things that you can do if you think that your cortisol may be too high. Please go listen to my episode last Tuesday for advice on that. But if you just cut out your coffee, that's not going to be the thing that lowers your cortisol and everything's going to be great, because coffee is only contributing to like a spike. It's not what's contributing to this chronic stress. The chronic stress is due to putting yourself under a lot of physical stress or a lot of emotional stress for a prolonged period of time. A coffee is probably not going to do that. Maybe bring it down to one coffee while also improving your sleep, while also making sure that you're giving your body adequate rest in between your workouts, while also eliminating, whenever possible, psychological stress. You want to be hitting it from every angle. But if you're someone that has chronic stress, eliminating the coffee is probably not going to do the job for you. That's not really the cause of the chronic stress. So you've got to think, is this causing my chronic stress? And no, it's not. So the things that are causing you chronic stress are where you are under chronic stress, and coffee is just not it. I'm sorry, there's just so much. If you feel anxious, yes, if you get the physical symptoms, don't drink coffee. But is coffee bad for you? No. In fact, there are so many studies that show that coffee has numerous neuroprotective effects. So many, okay? So I'm yet to see a paper published, a legitimate paper published that says that coffee is bad for your brain. Coffee is bad for your health. It's not, okay? So I think that we need to take what we see from social media with a grain of salt, and we need to think, things will someone will take a fun fact and then run with it, and then it kind of gets blown out of proportion. But when people say, if you don't want to have a puffy face in the mornings, cut out coffee, I don't know how serious to take that, to be dead honest. So I think you should just everything in moderation. If coffee feels good for you, great. Maybe don't have coffee after 1 p.m., 2 p.m. See how many coffees a day work for you. Try having coffee 1 hour after waking. I like to have coffee on an empty stomach. I feel it's great. Some people don't, but coffee on an empty stomach is not going to cause chronic stress. I can't stress that enough, okay? It's going to cause the good stress. It's going to cause the body to let's fucking go, let's fucking do this. And not in a way of hustle, I've got to work hard, just in the natural way, in the sense that you want to be most alert in the morning and least alert at nighttime, okay? That is what we're talking about. Back to basics, back to balance, okay? Cool beans. That is the episode. Cool coffee beans. That is the episode of today. I love coffee so much. I think I needed to tell you that because you guys probably know. Not Spon. I'm not sponsored by the coffee industry, but good times. So hopefully that made you feel a little bit more relaxed and less stressed about your coffee consumption. Also, another thing that's really good to consume if you're like, oh, but I want to feel alert, but I don't want to have coffee. Try matcha. Matcha is quite high in L-theanine, and L-theanine is great at keeping you relatively calm, but also increasing your focus and alertness as well. So I've got a whole brain fact on L-theanine, so I haven't gone into that today, but matcha is a great, so I do normally like 2 coffees and a matcha, or 3 coffees, or just 3 matchas, or whatever. But they are great. Matcha's great, coffee's great, good times. Enjoy your latte. That is all for today. Love you guys so much, and I will see you here or talk to you next time. As always, remember, be kind to yourself, be kind to your brain. Don't take shit from anyone, and especially don't take shit from yourself. Duncan!